A single policy buried in a December memo just gave China the power to shut down the world's most advanced chip factories overnight. And the West? They walked straight into the trap. When December arrived, most people were thinking about holiday plans. But in Beijing, something far more calculated was unfolding. Chinese officials quietly rolled out a new export rule that didn't make front-page headlines, but sent tremors through boardrooms across 3 continents. The policy was simple on paper. Any lithography equipment containing as little as 0.1% of rare earth materials sourced from China would now need Beijing's explicit permission before leaving the country. Didn't matter who built it. Didn't matter where it was headed. If even a fragment of those materials came from Chinese soil, China now had veto power. This wasn't red tape. This was leverage, carefully designed and coldly deployed. And the target? A company most people have never heard of, but one that quietly controls the future of everything digital. ASML, based in the Netherlands, manufactures the only machines on Earth capable of printing the world's most cutting-edge computer chips. Without ASML, there are no smartphones with the processing power we take for granted. No data centers running artificial intelligence. No electric vehicles with the brains to drive themselves. The entire scaffolding of the modern economy rests on technology that flows through a single choke point, and China just put its hand on the valve. But to understand how we arrived at this flashpoint, you have to rewind the clock a few months, to a courtroom decision in Amsterdam that seemed routine at the time, but turned out to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in European industrial history. The seizure that started it all. It was September 30th. A Dutch appeals court made what it believed was a necessary move to protect national interests. Judges ordered the seizure of Nexperia, a semiconductor company with deep ties to China. The CEO was removed. Outside administrators were installed. 99% of the company's shares were transferred into an independent trust. The justification? Governance concerns. National security risks. The kind of language governments use when they want to sound decisive. On the surface, it looked like Europe taking control. But there was a fatal flaw in the plan, one that became painfully obvious within days. Nexperia wasn't just some abstract corporate entity. It was a circulatory artery in the global supply chain. Back in 2019, a Chinese firm called Wingtech Technology had acquired Nexperia for $3.6 billion. Since then, the company had grown into something essential, especially for the automotive world. Every year, Nexperia churns out around 110 billion semiconductor chips. These aren't the glamorous processors that power iPhones or gaming consoles. They're the unglamorous workhorses, the chips that manage braking systems, battery controls, sensors, and safety features in cars built by Volkswagen, Toyota, Tesla, and dozens of other manufacturers. Here's where the Dutch miscalculated. Yes, Europe now controlled Nexperia's legal structure, the paperwork, the corporate headquarters, but more than 2/3 of Nexperia's actual manufacturing capacity, the factories, the production lines, the real industrial muscle, remained physically located inside China. Facilities in Dongguan and Shanghai kept humming along, answering to a different set of rules. Europe held the ownership documents, China held the factories, and in a supply chain crisis, the factories are what matter. Beijing didn't waste time. Within 72 hours, Chinese regulators moved. Export restrictions were imposed on Nexperia's Chinese plants. Shipments to European customers were frozen. Production that had been running at near full throttle dropped to a crawl. Chips that were supposed to be crossing borders stayed put. The impact hit Europe like a freight train. When the assembly lines went dark, Volkswagen was among the first to feel it. The company's massive Wolfsburg plant, the beating heart of German automotive production, ground to a halt. Every day the factory sat idle, Volkswagen was burning through more than $100 million in lost output. BMW wasn't spared either. Delivery timelines for high-end vehicles that used to be measured in weeks suddenly stretched to half a year. Customers who had placed orders were told to wait indefinitely, Within 14 days, the damage was staggering. European automakers collectively lost more than $3.5 billion. Around 12,000 workers were either laid off or saw their hours slashed. And the pain didn't stay confined to Europe. Across the Atlantic, Honda began shutting down plants in North America. A major Canadian facility was operating at barely 50% capacity. The global nature of the crisis became impossible to deny. Over 85% of Europe's largest industrial companies had been sourcing chips from Nexperia's Chinese operations. Nearly one-third of automotive suppliers relied on Nexperia as their sole certified provider. You might wonder, couldn't they just switch suppliers? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Automotive chips aren't like ordering a new charger off Amazon. They require years of testing and certification. Safety standards are rigid. Switching vendors means starting that process from scratch, and by the time a replacement is qualified, the damage is already done. By early November, Germany's Automotive Industry Association was openly threatening the Dutch government. They invoked Article 17 of the EU Chips Act, a provision that allows Brussels to override national decisions in moments of crisis. The message was clear: fix this, or we'll take the decision out of your hands. But even as European leaders scrambled to contain the fallout, they had no idea that the real blow was still coming. On December 1st, Beijing unveiled its second move, and this one cut far deeper. The new policy targeted rare earth elements, a category of minerals most people have never thought about, but which are absolutely critical to high-tech manufacturing. These aren't just valuable, they're irreplaceable in certain applications. And, China controls nearly 90% of the world's refining capacity. Here's where ASML enters the picture. ASML builds extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, or EUV systems. These are the most sophisticated manufacturing tools ever created. Each one costs upwards of $200 million. They use light with wavelengths so short that it can etch patterns onto silicon wafers at scales smaller than a virus. Without these machines, you simply cannot produce the most advanced chips in the world. Not for smartphones, not for supercomputers, not for military systems. And every single one of those machines depends on rare earth materials that are refined in China. Inside an EUV system, the optics need to be polished to near-perfect precision. That requires cerium oxide, a rare earth compound, processed to a purity level of 99.9%. Chinese refiners hit that mark consistently. Facilities in the United States? Well, they struggle to reach 93%, which just isn't good enough. Then there are the magnets. EUV machines use powerful magnets made from neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These materials are essential for the system's internal mechanics. In some configurations, the magnet assemblies alone account for more than 30% of the machine's total cost. ASML has tried using conventional alternatives, but every attempt has resulted in either skyrocketing costs or a measurable drop in performance. The implication is, honestly, brutally simple. In the race to dominate semiconductors, controlling the raw materials can be just as powerful as controlling the technology itself. And right now, China holds that advantage. ASML's chief financial officer, Roger Dassin, has been candid about the company's exposure. The stockpile of rare earth materials ASML currently has on hand. It's enough to sustain operations for roughly 8 weeks. After that, the company is entirely dependent on fresh shipments from China. If those shipments are delayed, whether through bureaucratic slowdowns or outright denials, ASML's production could drop by 15 to 20 machines per month. Given that each machine is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the financial hit could exceed $3 billion annually. But the real danger isn't just lost revenue. ASML sits at a unique and honestly terrifying position in the global economy. The company supplies lithography equipment to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Samsung, Intel, and virtually every other major chip maker on the planet. Those companies, in turn, produce the processors and memory chips that go into products made by Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm, and countless others. If ASML's production falters for an extended period, the disruption cascades: consumer electronics, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, advanced defense systems. All of it depends on a supply chain that now has a single point of failure, and that failure point is sitting squarely in China's sphere of influence. The rare earth materials ASML sources from China represent more than a quarter of China's total rare earth exports. What looks like ordinary trade is, in reality, strategic leverage. The geopolitical trap. This vulnerability didn't appear by accident. In December of the previous year, the United States placed Wingtech Technology on its entity list as part of a broader effort to limit China's access to advanced semiconductor technology. Then, on September 29th, Washington expanded those restrictions to cover any subsidiary where a blacklisted company held more than 50% ownership. That policy went into effect just one day before Dutch authorities seized Nexperia. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Netherlands believed it was acting in coordination with the United States, and that this alignment would lead to a manageable outcome. It didn't. Beijing's response was swift and surgical. Chinese officials made it clear: if the West wants to cut off China's access to advanced chip-making equipment, China can cut off the raw materials needed to build that equipment in the first place. No tariffs, no formal sanctions. Just a quiet tightening of dependencies that were already embedded in the system. On October 9th, China introduced case-by-case approval requirements for equipment used to manufacture logic chips at 14 nanometers or smaller, memory chips with 256 layers or more, and a broad range of associated materials. These thresholds weren't random. They were carefully chosen to target the exact stages of production that define technological leadership in semiconductors. China was applying pressure at the intersection of innovation and national security, and doing so with precision. 3 decades of strategic planning. This dominance didn't happen overnight. Over the past 30 years, China has methodically built control over every stage of the rare earth supply chain. From mining and extraction to refining, magnet production, and downstream components, Chinese state-supported companies now command nearly 90% of global refining capacity and hold overwhelming market share in high-performance magnets. Meanwhile, Western efforts to reduce dependence are still in their infancy. In July of last year, the U.S. Department of Defense invested $400 million into MP Materials, making the government the largest shareholder in the only active rare earth mine in the United States. It was a significant step, but analysts were quick to point out that it won't bring the country anywhere close to self-sufficiency in the near term. Building alternative supply chains for rare earths isn't something you can accomplish in a few years. It requires sustained political commitment, enormous capital investment, and a development timeline of 10 to 15 years before meaningful production levels are achieved. Europe faces similar constraints. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act aims to produce 7,000 tons of rare earth magnets domestically by 2030. It's a recognition of the problem, but even if that target is met, it would only partially reduce reliance on Chinese sources. The vulnerability no one wants to admit. What we're witnessing is a fundamental mismatch. Geopolitical strategies can shift overnight. Export controls can be implemented with the stroke of a pen. But rebuilding the industrial infrastructure that underpins advanced technology? That takes decades. And in the meantime, the global semiconductor system remains exposed. China has spent 30 years building a position of strategic dominance, not through military force, but through patient, methodical control of the materials that make modern technology possible. The West, by contrast, outsourced that entire supply chain in the name of efficiency and cost savings. Now the bill is coming due. The Netherlands thought it was making a decisive move to protect national security. Instead, it triggered a crisis that revealed just how fragile the entire system really is. European car factories went dark. Billions of dollars evaporated. Workers lost their jobs. And all of it could have been avoided if policymakers had understood one simple truth. In the modern economy, raw materials are just as powerful as patents. This isn't just a story about chips or rare earths or trade policy. It's a story about power, and where power actually lives in the 21st century. It lives in the materials that nobody thinks about until they're gone. It lives in the dependencies that were built slowly, quietly, over decades, while everyone was looking the other way. China didn't need to fire a shot. It just needed to wait for the right moment and then turn off the tap. The question now isn't whether the West can rebuild these supply chains. It's whether they'll have the time to do it before the next crisis hits. If this opened your eyes to how fragile the systems we depend on really are, hit that subscribe button. We're breaking down the hidden power struggles shaping the world, the ones that don't make the evening news but will define the next decade. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think the West can actually break free from this dependency, or is it already too late? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.